Name and job title, please.
Nathan Johns, journalist at the Irish Times.
Incredible that you didn't introduce yourself as Andy McBride hater. But anyway, we're going to talk about Lorcan Tucker today. How good do you think Lorcan Tucker is at batting? And try and ignore the fact that you know I've got a lot of opinions on this.
Yeah, well, that's an impossible task because his record in the last 18 months, ever since they finally stopped using him as a specialist keeper who batted with the tail, has been really good, especially in T20 cricket. At one point, he was averaging over 50, batting at number 3. That's come down a little bit, but it's still, as a T20 average goes, it's pretty high. He's had a couple of decent days out in one-day cricket recently. He bats a little bit higher up than he has in the past, and obviously, he's got a Test match 100, and he had a good day, second innings at Lords recently when he got 40 odd. So he's a good player. He's a fascinating guy because as I'm sure you'll get into, the wicket keeping is interesting. His standards there. Some people in Irish cricket, and not even Irish cricket, just talking to various different analysts and stuff at Lords during the week. Some people actually think he's better technically than Tector, even though Tector's record is ridiculous in the last 12 months. I personally don't necessarily agree with that. I think Tector is a slightly better player, and maybe that's just biased because Tector's been doing this from a young age, whereas Tucker's doing this age 26, and the first 3-4 years of his career wasn't like that. But I think, I know what you think, but I think as Irish wicket keepers go, could easily end up being the best of them. He could easily end up with a better international record than Niall O'Brien or Gary Wilson.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be shocked if he doesn't beat Gary Wilson's international records. Niall O'Brien was a really good player, to be fair. If they even just got that out of him, I think he would be very good. But I think he has a lot more natural talent than Nobby. Sorry, Niall. He will listen to this too because he listens to everything. Or someone will tell him about it now. But I certainly think he can go to that level. So it's interesting. I want to start on the worst part of his batting, which is ODI cricket, because you said that he's done really well, and I felt that he'd done really well. His average in one-day cricket overall is 21, right? And when he has batted up the order, so when he's batted at number 5, his average is 22. When he's batted at number 6, his average is 23. He's way worse when he's at number 7, don't get me wrong, and he struggled a little bit in a couple of games at number 4. He's played some good innings in one-day cricket, but he doesn't look like he has the ability to consistently make runs in one-day cricket at the moment. And the reason I bring that up is most of the hype about him as a batter over that last 18 months that you're talking about has been T20 cricket and has been Test cricket. So we would assume that one-day cricket record will eventually get better one way or another. It may not ever be, the world's greatest ODI cricket. It may not fit the style. But the problem when you do look at his record overall is he is 26 years old, and yet he does have very low averages pretty much across the board outside of Test cricket at the moment, where in his 4 tests he's done very well. Is it just that he hit a purple patch in the last 18 months? Is it just that he went up the order? It still hasn't changed his overall average as much. Is it more a case of a little bit like Curtis Campher, where we have now all seen him play incredible innings, whether it be the one against Australia, whether it be the one in the Test match, all these different innings that we've now seen of him, that we are ignoring the fact that he still actually fails at a fairly high level outside of those brilliant innings. So he has a very high ceiling, but he maybe has a lower floor than other players still.
Well, I think there's 2 things to that. Actually, first of all, because I think it's important to mention, and I'll forget otherwise, I think there's a really good chance he opens the batting in this tournament in Zimbabwe because they have changed openers. Stephen Doheney struggled. He had I think he had a run of 9 or 10 games opening the batting with Paul Sterling. Had a pretty significant technical flaw, basically kept cutting short wide ones straight to point. So they got rid of him. PJ Moore's the guy who came in, but as we've said in previous discussions, he's been told he's a middle order white ball player by the powers that be. So somebody's moving up the order, and I think they have considered doing this with Tucker in the past because pinch blocker Andy McBride, they've always struggled to get someone in that top 3 alongside Sterling and Balbirnie. It might be that Balbirnie opens and Tucker goes to 3, but I think there's a decent chance. I've had conversations about it in the past. They're not saying anything definitive now, but I think so. He moved up the order in T20 cricket and it worked for him. So it's going to be interesting if they do move him up the order and what does that do to his ODI record. The answer to your question about a purple patch but we don't know because you don't know it's a purple patch until the purple patch finishes.
That's very true.
So we just kind of have to almost wait and see on that front. But I don't know. It just you mentioned there's been failures outside the big knocks. It feels like in the last 18 months those failures have been fewer and far between. And he's 26. He's had a long time of batting 7 and 8. Like, he started his career, I think, batting quite low, and they didn't really see him as much of a batter. He was the wicket keeper, and he could maybe shepherd the tail a little bit and make sure Adair got on strike to slog a few at the back end of an innings. But he wasn't that player like Adair or even McCarthy now, who can come in and slog from ball one. So he kind of struggled a little bit early career. So I wonder if he gets a couple of years of not being forced to do that, does that bump up the numbers? So it's a really interesting one. So the answer to your question is I don't know.
Well, let's go back to the order thing, because I think this is quite interesting. So he's batted kind of everywhere at this point. Like, he started at number 8, but he was very young then. But he played a lot at number 7, and he played a lot at number 7 at times when Ireland didn't have. I mean, with the retirement of Wilson and Porterfield and I don't know, Joyce and O'Brien and I don't know, am I missing any of the older guys? They lost a lot of talent. Kevin O'Brien, they lost a lot of talent in that sort of middle batting area, and yet he still batted at number 7 quite a bit. It isn't that straight away they thrust him up the order. That makes me feel like they're not completely certain that he is a top order player.
So they weren't. It took them quite a while. I mean, you just kind of chat to people in and around with the squad and stuff. I think my opinion is that it took senior players, which is arguably more important, a while to rate him, because he was in his own club and in Leinster cricket, which is where that's his province in the Interpost system. He was always really highly rated. He was an all rounder up until about the age of 15, I think.
He wanted to be Brett Lee.
He wanted to be Brett Lee. He wanted to be Brett Lee. He got me out plenty of times playing underage cricket as a fast bowler, and he was like, when he was like 13, he was fast for his age, if I remember correctly.
But you were about 4 when he was 13, right? Like, I mean, he was.
No, he
had only, you by a couple of years.
Yeah, he's about 18 months older than me, I think. Okay. So yeah. I mean,
then you should have done better. You shouldn't be going out to a wicketkeeper, Nate.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there was one time actually I just moved across one and tried to flick it off my hip and forgot that I'd moved across and exposed all 3 stumps, and so that was the dismissal that I remember. Anyway, completely irrelevant.
No, it's great for you to relive all your misery on this podcast.
Thank you. It's been an interesting experience from being labelled the Andy O'Brien hater to being asked to go through my childhood trauma of getting out to wicketkeepers. But yeah, I think it sounds like it took senior players who are still in that side quite a long time to rate him, which is interesting because the skipper comes from the same club as him, so he would have seen a lot of him as a kid, and would have presumably seen that he was a kind of a hot shot batter back in the day. So that's quite interesting. They obviously rated him enough to go when he moved up the order against the USA at the back end of 2021, because that was back in the middle of the ill-fated Gareth Delaney bats at 3 in our T20 team experiment, and he got COVID. So they said, right, well, we just need someone to bat at 3, and they said, right, well, let's just see. We think Lorcan might be able to do it. Let's see what he did. And I think he got 80 in his first game, and he hasn't looked back since. So I think that was when he definitely earned some confidence, more than he had at the start of his career.
But even that, I mean, that's a little bit of luck, right? Like, if there wasn't sickness on that tour, he wouldn't have been pushed up. I'd say my theory is, and I spent a lot of time looking at him this week, but also looking at a lot of footage of him, and I've got quite obsessed with him, because when he first came in, I thought, this is a specialist keeper who can chip the ball around a little bit and will be handy with the bat, but nothing more. And in the last 18 months, I know I get asked about Lorcan Tucker like on every third podcast, right? It's incredible how often he comes up. And I've said fairly consistently, I think I got it wrong. And I think he's a better player than what I thought. But now I'm starting to think, well, wait a minute. There must have been something that I was seeing, and that perhaps the island captain and, other Irish people were seeing. And so as you're more than aware, because you had to sit next to me, I got really obsessed with him this week. He really does have almost, I call it hyperactive keeper disorder, right? He can't sit still at the crease. He's moving all the time. He wants to be involved in everything when he's batting. I think you were next to me when I was counting. There were 5 balls in a row where he didn't just stand still and face a ball. He either moved forward or back against a fast bowler. Against Jack Leach, he was backing away outside leg stump when he didn't need to do that. It's Jack Leach on day one. Just play the ball on its merits and you'll score against him. He's not a particularly hard spinner to face on day one of a test match. And I do think all of those things, if you were a senior batter, and especially if you think about Irish batting, you know, Bell Burney, O'Brien, Porterfield, Joyce, these are, you know, Wilson, these are very, not conservative batters, but they liked, they weren't, you know, reckless in any way. They were, you know, sort of thorough professional batters. Lorcan doesn't really profile like any of those guys. He does more profile like a modern younger player who's been, you know, electrocuted. There's a bit of Harry Brook in the way that he plays, right? Like, of where you can't actually stop him from doing anything. And I wonder if that energy and the mistakes he would have made because of that is part of the reason that they didn't quite trust him.
Maybe it's an interesting one. They certainly back it, because when it comes off, it looks really good. Like he was charging Mitchell Starc and hitting him over his head back in that Australian, as you mentioned, or even on day 3, there was that crack. He charges down abroad and plays this expansive drive that had everyone, or had, you know, in the crowd going ooh and ah, you know. So it works for him from time to time, as does certain other shots, but they also do get him out, as I'm sure you're going to come on to. He gets out a lot playing the shots that he thinks he's good at. So yeah, it is very interesting. What I took away from the test was speaking to Gary Wilson on, I think it was after day 2, when Tucker did stay a lot stiller in that evening session. He didn't look to sweep Leach as much. He actually played Leach. He flicked him quite well. They left the gap in mid-wicket open, and he just kind of got his on top of the ball, not a lot of spin, and started flicking to mid-wicket for 2 or 3 boundaries. He played him in the V a lot more than trying to sweep him as he did on day 1. And Gary Wilson kind of said, yeah, we had a chat to Lorcan about the tempo of his innings, about how, you know, and I think the subtext of that was how you don't need to be this, you know, hyperactive Duracell bunny. You can stay in your crease a little bit more and just play strong shots to get yourself in. And then if you start getting bogged down a little bit, that's when you can kind of use the crease a bit more to try and counteract and throw pressure back on the bowlers, which was interesting, because Tucker did bat very differently in the evening session of day 2 than he did in his first innings, when he was moving around a lot more. But then on day 3 he started moving around again, and like I said, it worked. There was cracking drives off Stuart Broad, but it's ultimately how he got out trying to sweep again.
Yeah, it and all that sort of stuff's really interesting as well, because he's batted down the order, there's probably something within him that thinks that, I don't want to say imposter syndrome. I don't mean this in a bad way, but everyone has it, right? Like, there's a point of him where he's not sure what he is at the moment, and he's probably been the crackerjack wicketkeeper batter like a lot of his time. And even when he was throwing up the order in T20, he was thrown up because he was the crackerjack, right? But he actually has, and this is why I find him so fascinating as a batter, because I think he has the skills. You mentioned Harry Tector and whether Harry Tector was better technically, right? I actually think that if you pare back all the nonsense around Lorcan's batting, there's almost not much wrong with him technically at all. He's a very fundamentally sound technical batter, but he also has the ability to go to that 5th and 6th gear in a way that it would take Tector an hour to warm up to ever find that kind of gear, right? Just different ways that they go about their batting. And I do wonder how they, as a cricket body, but also, you know, personal coaches that he has, you know, anyone he's working with, how you get it so that he understands when he needs to use 6th gear and when he needs to use 4th gear, right? He's probably never going to be a guy who's going to spend a lot of time in 1st or 2nd gear, but he's got to work out how to sort of go ramp up and ramp down. And that the 3rd morning when we turned up, like, I was watching him bat and I was like, he's going to go out. Like, he's not going to make 100 here. He's going to make a mistake. Whereas the night before, I was thinking, if he just bats like this the whole time, there's nothing in this pitch and there's nothing in this bowling attack that should bother him here. So that, working with that sort of stuff. But what's interesting is he's coming very close to his peak batting years, right? And it feels like he still doesn't know the best way to use his own talents yet. And maybe a lot of that is because he hasn't done a lot of batting at the top level in the top order. Because that's where you learn that. You don't learn that at number 6, 7, and 8, right? You learn that in the top order, playing your best batting. And he's still in development because he hasn't batted high enough for long enough. And also, and you and I talked about this on a whole nother podcast, but he also just doesn't bat. Ireland he doesn't play enough cricket, especially probably 4-day cricket that he needs to play to be able to work out all those different things. So they're in a really interesting position where he might just end up being a wicketkeeper who averages 26, 27, but everyone remembers his greatest innings, or he ends up being a number 5 and bats behind Harry Tector in red ball cricket, and then in white ball cricket bats at 3 or 4, wherever they need him. He could go in any direction from here on in, and it's how Ireland cricket makes him understand what he's best at is such a fascinating way forward.
And I think he understands that as well to an extent, because just on your point about you need to learn at the top of the order. I mean, I spoke to him during the Afghanistan series they had last August. I think it was August last year up in Belfast, when again that was like the first. He had a 5-game series at batting at number 3, and he scored a lot of runs, and they won that series. And he scored a lot of runs against Rashid Khan, which was really interesting. And he kind of said, yeah, look, when I was batting 7 or 8, I just didn't really know what my role was. Yeah. It was come in and slog, or get someone else on strike, get Harry or whoever it was still in on strike, or do I slog, or do I turn it over and let Mark Adair slog, who is batting lower than me but probably can hit down the ground better than me. So he just, again, confused. He kind of fits in with the narrative of this kind of hyperactive, confused guy, which is interesting because off the pitch he's not at all. He's like the most cerebral. Like he reads loads of books. He's like really interesting. He's not on social media. Like he's just the most quiet, down to earth guy you can imagine when he's not batting.
And you listen to him interviewed, and you're just like, this is a guy who he just seems like a smart professional cricketer.
He's really, really smart guy. Yeah, really, really intelligent guy. Which is why I think these conversations, he's probably had them 10 times already himself. Yeah.
I want to get back to something you said actually a minute ago. So this happened to Moeen Ali. So if you think about, if you're a talented young player in Irish cricket, right, would he have ever batted outside the top 4 or 5 other than when he was like 14 or 15, right? Like as he's coming through the system, my guess is he probably played top order cricket the majority of the time. Even as a keeper, he would have been right up the order because he would have been so good. And I remember with Moeen Ali, and I think Moeen Ali's been quite honest with this, Moeen Ali didn't know how to bat at number 7 or number 8 or even number 6. They'd never had to bat in those positions before, and they are different kinds of positions. So you've got someone who did that, who probably was, outside of when he was very, very young, has probably always been a top order player and was probably thrown in above, because of how talented he is, he was probably thrown in up the order. He then gets the Irish team and he's further down the order. He gets confused by that. And now he's got like the ghosts of batting at number 7 and number 6, maybe, in his head. But he actually has to go out there and learn how to bat 3, 4, 5 again. These things do confuse professional athletes. I know we think they shouldn't, but they do. And if you haven't played as much cricket as, perhaps he might have if he come through the county system, he might not be quite as grooved as he should be to be able to, conquer that in the way that they need him to.
And he relished that going back up. Like that's what he said during that Afghanistan series. He says, I know exactly what my role is every time I go out. And just that clarity kind of unlocked the 18 months he's had batting at 3 in T20 cricket. So it's a case of, like, even in the ODI side, they still move him around a little bit. Just sometimes Campher comes in at 5. I think if Tector and Tucker and Balbirnie have both scored hundreds, and it's the 35th over, they'll send in Dockrell because he'll just go in and try and whack it for 15 overs, as he's done later on in his career. So really, even in the test team, like, there's always a question of, okay, well, who does he bat 6? Does he bat 7? So him and Campher can often quite be interchangeable. So
he batted 7 in the test team recently. He was listed. I'm trying to think. This test match against England, he was 6, week. Wasn't he? Yeah.
Yeah.
So he has batted 7 again recently. Which again, if you are, he's clearly in the best 3 batting talents that they have. Right. Mm-hmm. If you look at pure batting, you'd still have Belbo in that top 3. Sterling has probably slipped a little bit now, and then you have Tector, and then you have Tucker, as it currently stands. Why is he batting at 7 again, right? Like, other than the fact he has wicket-keeping gloves, you would never have... If he didn't have wicket-keeping gloves on, there's no way you'd ever bat him at 7 in a test match.
The other thing is, what do they do with Campher? Because
he Tucker does behind Lorcan Tucker because he's not as good as him.
But Tucker... well, true, but I think maybe... I don't know if this is what they're thinking, but, trying to put myself in their shoes, who's a better power hitter? it's Lorcan Tucker. Whereas Curtis, they're both very similar in terms of they're both pretty good players to spin. They both sweep the ball a lot. Neither really uses their feet to spin that much. Neither hits down the ground. Neither of them clears the front leg and whacks the ball over mid-on. So they're both quite similar. So maybe they think, well, Tucker does at least charge the seamers and try to hit them over extra cover, so he can kind of maybe slog a few more at the back end and run really hard and get Dockrell on strike at the back end of an innings. Whereas if we're 20 for 3 in the 10th over and they're bringing on Sikandar Raza down in Bulawayo next week or whatever, Curtis is kind of the more steady, stay in his crease, knock it round, sweep well player. And that's kind of how it's been. Campher's kind of been their man for a crisis. Whereas I think they do see Tucker as a better late order option. But then the argument is, well, if he's a better player, like you said, just get your best players to face as many deliveries as possible, right? But then the question gets, what's Curtis Campher's role on the side? Because he doesn't necessarily bowl that many overs that regularly these days. He's a batter who bowls in their eyes. And if he's not going to bat 5 and not bowl that much, what's he doing in that team?
Well, I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. I understand why anyone would look at it that way, but I think it's the wrong way of looking at it, because I think what you do is you say, well, we've got a wicketkeeper who can bat top 6, right? Which allows us to have a bits and pieces all-rounder at number 7 who can maybe bowl half of his overs and bat really well and is probably one of our best fielders, right? The ability, once you have the ability to move a wicketkeeper up the order, you actually give yourself more flexibility when it comes to who plays behind there. So I don't have a problem with that at all, but I can understand why they would, not necessarily. I can understand why they wouldn't be the biggest fans of that sort of thing. But
even that's an interesting point, because that's kind of like a philosophical difference between the head coaches. So Graham Ford, who was the coach before Heinrich Milan, loved his bits and pieces guys, because they could scrap hard. He could cobble together 50 overs out of 7 or 8 guys. He loved it. Loved Campher. Like, he was the guy who brought Campher in. Loved Tyrone Kane. Picked him for that test match against Pakistan Malahide. Loved Stuart Thompson, who got a game at Lords. Like, loved these guys who could bowl a few overs. Were picked as bowlers, but had probably better records as batters than they did as bowlers, which is kind of the story of Irish cricket. McBrien and Adair nearly scoring tons at Lords, batting better than they bowled throughout the test match. Whereas I think Milan likes the idea of having your more clearly defined roles. He just doesn't have enough players to do that, and they end up relying on the bits and pieces guys, like George Dockrell's bowling again all of a sudden. So as a result, I think that's why they kind of try and put Campher up, and not always, because there are times when, like, I think Tucker did bat ahead of him in this test match, if I'm correct.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think he did.
So there are times when they do give Lorcan the opportunity to face as many deliveries as possible, because he is a better batter. But equally, there have been times when they go, well, no, Curtis isn't going to bowl 10 overs, so let's try and force him to be a top 5 player, if that makes sense.
There's nothing in Campher's game that suggests he could ever bat top 5 consistently in international cricket, outside of perhaps T20, because T20 might suit his skill sets a little bit more. That's not to slander him, because everything he's done with his talent is phenomenal, and he keeps improving and is very, very good. But you look at the way he played a shot against Jack Leach this week that looked like he was a number 9. Like, that's just not something that you would. That a top
was that the one he got out to?
No, he played a slog sweep where he decided very late to play it. He didn't get in position at all and just whacked his hands through. And that's the kind of player that Campher is. But he's not a top 5 international talent, right? At number 6, he's probably slightly below par. At number 7, he's probably okay. And that's kind of what I'm saying. If you bat him at number 7, he can probably average between 25 and 35 and have some high impact. Plus, he has a second skill. You can argue he's such a good fielder, he maybe has a third skill. I think that's the best way for him. Whereas Tucker, I actually want him to be up the order in every situation as much as possible, because I want him to learn more about batting, right? Like, his upside is so much more than Campher's upside is at the moment. That doesn't mean that Campher won't end up being a better player than him. That's a separate argument. But if you actually have a look at them, I don't think there's any bowler who's too quick for Lorcan Tucker in the world. He plays high pace very, very well. You talked about the Mitchell Starc shot before. We saw him against Broad and Tongue without any worry there. Spin is a different one, and we'll get there in a moment. But he's already made runs in Asia, which is a really, really good sign. He's made runs against Rashid Khan. Actually, let's go to spin now. Okay. This is interesting. So I won't get through all the numbers, but basically, when he's playing spinners, when he's playing attacking shots against spinners in Test match or when he's playing them in T20 cricket, I think it's something like 55% of his shots are sweeps, right? From an analytics point of view, any player who plays the sweep shot more than 5% of the time, we would consider a sweeper. So he's way up on that. Not quite up there with what's the is it Scott Edwards, the captain of Netherlands? I think he might be the world's most dramatic sweeper. He plays it every single ball, but he's not quite on that level. But he's very, very high up on the list. And so then you start to have a look at his record, and in T20 cricket he averages 16 when sweeping. It's not the average you want if it's the shot that you're playing the most often, especially for him because he at the moment still batting in the middle order. Although as you said, he might end up being an opener in certain formats. Then you've got the fact that in Test cricket, he averages 12 in T20 cricket playing the sweep, and then in Test cricket he averages 16 when playing the sweep. He's had 8 Test innings so far. He's been dismissed by spinners 5 times, and all 5 of those occasions are sweeps. And I became obsessed with this early on because he was out there batting to Jack Leach, and we both know he's a sweeper, and they had all the fielders up England. And I think I said to you straight away, does England know something that we don't know? Because it didn't make any sense to us that you wouldn't have someone out on the boundary, because that is just a normal thing to have for a player who sweeps. They got him out twice playing this shot. There's clearly a major issue here. Obviously, is it Scott Irvine? Is he the analyst?
Yeah, Scotty, yeah.
A very good analyst, all over Instagram if you want to check out his work. He would clearly, I don't think I'm the first person to notice this. Clearly, England had noticed it before I had, if no one else. I'm sure Scott would know that as well. That's a really interesting one. If he's going to be a middle order player, he has to have other shots to be able to score against spin, because as it currently stands, he may love the sweep shot, but the sweep shot does not love him.
Well, again, yeah, that same interview I referenced before when he talked about the role clarity. He said, I said, you swept that series, he scored a lot of runs off Rashid, and he swept him really well. And most people don't have any success sweeping Rashid.
A hard guy to sweep because he bowls a little bit shorter than everyone else.
Yeah, he's quick and flat, and he just said to me, I sweep everyone and everything. And I guess it's his go-to. So he goes to it a lot. He generally does score runs with it, but he gets out a lot as well. So, and it's kind of one of those things where I think cricketers love to say, if I haven't got to get out, at least I'm getting out playing my best shot or something like that. It brings me a lot of success, and if it brings risk, but the reward is going to be worth it. I mean, those numbers and those averages suggest that in his case, it's not worth it. But it was really interesting how he was trying to sweep. I mean, I can't remember. So there was 2 dismissals sweeping this week. I can't remember off the top of my head the ones in Asia in Test cricket out of the 5 that you mentioned. But both times, I think the first innings he kind of took a step down the track, a step outside off, and then swept late. So he kind of danced down the track thinking I might hit him over his head, and then last minute still looked to sweep and got in a muddle. And it was a little bit of an unlucky LBW decision because he was so far down, and it was one of those where 99% of umpires just never give that, and the umpire's call decision would stay his way, but it was given out. So it was a little bit unfortunate, but the movement was not great beforehand. And then in the second innings, again, there's no one back on the sweep, and he's looking to sweep fine, and he's moving across, and he ends up just completely getting in the wrong position to play it, and he gloves it onto his leg stump.
Well, I think he actually in that second innings, I think he's going to go. He has his bat up here, which won't make any sense to anyone listening on the podcast. But he has his bat up near his shoulder, like he's going to play that really fine, almost that shovel type paddle sweep. But then if you watch the shot he plays, he ends up playing a very normal sweep in the end, but from outside the off, from moving himself over a little bit. So it's like he made 2 different decisions on how to get the ball fine. Which in some ways shows he's a very adaptable sweeper. But again, every time, both of those dismissals come from him moving or changing his mind all the way through, which maybe shows, I think you used the word clarity before. Like there are times when I look at Lorcan Tucker and I'm like, I'm not sure how clear he is with what shot he is going to play here. Off the field, we know he has incredible clarity, but when he's on the field, it's not quite there as much. And the other thing that I would add to that is, do you remember that over that I was talking about before against Stuart Broad? So he runs down the wicket first ball. He then jumps back onto his stumps dramatically 3 times. And then the 5th ball, or the last ball of the over that he was facing, he runs down the wicket again. I get the idea of that. And I've obviously written about how modern batters are using their crease a lot more in Test cricket to try and put off bowlers. But what he's doing is putting himself in moving positions or dramatic positions over and over again. Whereas actually he could move very subtly into those positions and be completely set. It's the same with the sweep shot against Jack Leach in that first innings. He could have set himself up for that without jumping. If you look, he actually jumps into position. I think I've got a still of it where you can see him in midair and you can see the stumps underneath his feet, right? That's not what a really high-class batter should be doing. A high-class batter can move into those positions, but make sure that their head is still and everything else. There just is this sort of reckless energy to everything he's doing that comes across, and I think it's probably the easiest place to see it is when he's attacking a seam bowler or when he's playing these sweep shots. There's almost too much going on in his head for him to just be like, I'm just going to play this shot. It feels to me like, and I don't know how you conquer something like that, because I was a terrible batter who probably was exactly the same. I'm sure if someone was looking, if there was some idiot like me looking at my batting technique, they would have said the exact same thing. You've got a special visitor behind you on the video there too.
Sorry.
So the exact same thing, right? And I get it. I completely get it. That's the thing that it'd be really interesting to see if he could conquer, because I think everything else is there. I think all the game is there. And I think it comes out in sweeping, but I don't think it's a sweeping error, if that makes sense.
Well, I think with the sweep was really interesting because it's what he was trying to do with the sweep. And we mentioned there was no one back on the shot. So you just need to hit it and hit it hard. You don't necessarily need to be worried about too much about where it goes, because with no one back, you just need to hit a yard either side of that man who was on square leg. You don't necessarily need to be going to the exaggerated, okay, I need to get it really fine because square leg inside the ring, or not ring in Test cricket, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Is on square, so I need to get really... You just need to get into a position and hit it hard, and, you've got a fairly decent chance of beating him. Or even if that man was back, you don't need... He's sweeping for boundaries instead of using it as an option to get off strike.
Yeah. Well, also, if you... I think you're right. If he can play the sweep well, and all he has to do is play a conventional sweep 6 times, right, over 3 overs to Leach, and there's probably 2 boundaries in that, without him worrying about where the field is exactly set, right? Just because he's going to be hitting the ball quite hard, and as you said, if he gets at 1.5 meters to either side of any of those fielders, whereas in actual fact, what he was trying to do was make sure that every single sweep went into a gap, or every single sweep was absolutely smashed, and I'm not sure he needed to do either of those things in that situation.
We saw how Mark Adair swept when he got runs, and he just didn't really care where the field was. He said, right, I'm just going to put my foot down the wicket, hit it hard.
Yeah.
And because of the line of the ball, quite often he had to fetch it from outside off, but he's in a good position. So because he's trying to hit it hard in front of square, but having to fetch it, it's going behind square and in that gap anyway. So it was almost as if, just Adair was just so much more clear in what he was trying to do. He's just trying to, Joe was just tossing it up, and feeding him the stroke to the short boundary. And he goes, right, well, I'm just going to try and hit it hard and back myself, like you said, 2 out of 6 times to find boundary, and because you're not trying to maneuver yourself so much or get into gaps, it's a more risk-free option. And like you said, if you get 2 out of 6, it's worth it. So it was just really interesting, the different approaches. And I think we watch Joe Root's a sweeper all the time, but how often does he use it as a boundary option, and how often is it just his go-to to get one and get off strike? And I think that the difference is because all that movement is because he's like, okay, I do sweep and I have to sweep loads, but I have to sweep for boundaries because that's my shot, instead of just, like we said, hit the ball hard. If there is a fielder back, just get one and you'll hit a gap enough times to make it worth it. Or, like I said, just stay still and just back yourself because you played the shot so much and so well normally.
Last question, and then I'll let you go. Where do you think he's going to end up as a batter? Is he going to be a top 5 player across all 3 formats? Or are we going to continue to see him float around everywhere? Or eventually will we see him further down the order and that will be his role?
Yes, top to the first top 5 batter, purely because they need someone in the top 3. They still need someone up there with Sterling and Balbirnie, and I think there's a decent chance he's the next cab off the rank, so to speak, in 50 over cricket. He'll stay batting at 3 in T20 cricket because he's had so much success. And I think they will eventually... I think in Test cricket they have realised that he won't be a top 5 player in Test cricket now because Sterling is still playing Test cricket, and he's not going to go up and open the batting anytime soon, so he'll bat 6 there. And then also bear in mind, like, Lorcan's 26. We don't know how long Paul Sterling's going to go before he decides to truly take the franchise money, so there could be another option there. I think Balbirnie will still play for a long time. There's no question of him going anytime soon. But Ireland already don't have a settled top three, and that might become more unsettled in the next year or two, potentially. And look, like you said, he's one of their best batting talents, and I think they will come to the conclusion that it's worth giving him a long go already now, and then it definitely will be in a year or two, I think.
Thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.